A millionaire gave $350 to a beggar to buy food for her child. The next morning, he saw her at the grave of his beloved who died 23 years ago. Richard Lawson sat at a table in one of New York City's most exclusive restaurants, but the luxury surrounding him felt meaningless. Nothing could fill the emptiness inside. He gazed out the window, watching the rain pour down onto the streets, the droplets sliding down the glass like tears, mirroring the weight in his heart. The world outside was gray and dreary, perfectly reflecting his mood. Always rainy, always dark, always lonely. It had been this way for over 2 decades, ever since his wife, Emily, had died tragically. Richard had never been able to move on. Her death had left a hole that no amount of money or success could fill. Despite building a financial empire, his victories felt hollow. Business meetings, lavish dinners, everything had become a distraction from the pain he carried with him every day. Absent-mindedly, Richard swirled the wine in his glass, watching it spin in circles. Business deals, fancy events, luxurious surroundings, it all tasted bland now. None of it mattered. He sighed, feeling the weight of the years press down on him, heavier than ever. The truth was, despite all his success, Richard was utterly alone. He had no children, at least, none that he knew of. Emily had never wanted to discuss the idea of kids before she passed, and Richard hadn't pushed her. Now, he regretted it deeply. What he wouldn't give to have a piece of her still alive, something of her to protect and love. After paying the bill, Richard stood up and slipped into his wool coat. The restaurant buzzed with conversations and laughter, but to him, it was just noise, distant, as if happening in another world. He stepped out onto the wet sidewalk, where the rain continued to fall, cold and relentless. The city pulsed with life around him, but Richard felt nothing but the chill of the rain and the weight of his solitude. The walk home led him past places he and Emily used to visit together. Every corner, every building seemed tied to a memory of a simpler, happier time. But now, all that remained were ghosts and a headstone. Tomorrow, like most days, he would visit Emily's grave. Paris might have been the natural place for her to rest, but for reasons Richard never fully understood, she had chosen New York. Perhaps it was because the city represented the new life they had started together, a life that had been cut too short. As Richard walked along the rain-soaked sidewalk, something caught his eye. Under the awning of a small shop, a young woman sat huddled, clutching a baby in her arms. Her hair was damp from the rain, making her look even more fragile. The sight tugged at something deep within him. He paused, unsure of what to do. Richard wasn't the kind of man to get personally involved in situations like this. Over the years, he had made countless donations to charities, but dealing with someone in need face-to-face was unfamiliar. Yet, there was something about this woman that made him stop. Maybe it was the way she held the baby, so carefully, with a tenderness that reminded him of something long lost. He approached slowly, rain dripping from his coat. "Here," he said, pulling out $350 in cash he had just withdrawn from an ATM. He handed it to her. "Use this to get some food for you and your baby." The woman looked up at him, her eyes wide with surprise, then filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice shaky. "Thank you so much." For a moment, Richard felt something stir inside him, a connection to this stranger, like their pain was somehow shared. He didn't say anything more, just nodded and walked away. But as he continued down the street, he couldn't stop thinking about what he had just witnessed. It was as if something had awakened inside him, something he hadn't realized was still there. When he finally got home, the moment lingered, the feeling of connection haunting him long after the rain had stopped. For Richard was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. He lay down in bed, the sound of the rain tapping against the window his only companion. He closed his eyes, but the image of the woman and her baby kept replaying in his mind. Tomorrow, as always, he would visit Emily's grave. Little did he know that routine visit was about to change his life forever. The next morning, Richard followed his usual routine. He woke early, dressed in his typical tailored suit, and prepared for his visit to the cemetery. The gray sky outside his window matched his mood perfectly, and the city was still wet from the storm that had drenched it the night before. Grabbing his coat, he headed out, the familiar heaviness settling into his chest as he prepared for yet another somber visit. As Richard made his way to the cemetery, his thoughts kept returning to the young woman and her baby. He couldn't understand why that image lingered. Over the years, he had seen countless people in need, but something about this particular encounter stuck with him. There had been a look in her eyes, desperation mixed with something deeper, something he couldn't quite place. It unsettled him. Arriving at the cemetery, Richard took his usual path toward Emily's grave. The place was quiet, the only sounds coming from the rustling of leaves and the distant hum of the city. He knew this place too well. Each visit followed the same pattern. He would stand in front of her headstone, talk to her as if she were still there, then leave, feeling the same emptiness that had haunted him since the day she died. But today was different. As he approached the grave, Richard noticed something unusual. Someone was already there, kneeling in front of Emily's headstone. His heart skipped a beat. It was the same young woman from the night before, the baby cradled in her arms. She was hunched over, her shoulders shaking as though she were crying. Richard stopped in his tracks, his mind racing. What was she doing here? How could she possibly know about Emily? The coincidence was too strange, too unsettling. A wave of confusion and unease washed over him as he cautiously approached her. "Excuse me," Richard said, his voice low and uncertain. The woman looked up, startled. Her eyes were red and puffy, and she quickly wiped her face with the sleeve of her worn jacket. "I'm sorry," she mumbled, trying to compose herself. "I didn't mean to intrude." Richard shook his head, still trying to process what he was seeing. "You were there yesterday," he said slowly, "outside the restaurant. I gave you money." The woman nodded, glancing down at the baby in her arms, as if that explained everything. But for Richard, it wasn't enough. He needed to understand what was happening, why this woman, this stranger, was here at his wife's grave. "What are you doing here?" Richard asked, his voice firmer now. "How do you know Emily?" For a moment, the woman hesitated, as if weighing whether to answer. Then, with a deep breath, she looked up at him, her eyes filled with a strange mix of pain and resolve. "Emily, she was my mother," she said softly. Richard felt the ground shift beneath him. His breath caught in his throat, and for a moment he thought he might have misheard her. He stared at the woman in disbelief, his mind struggling to catch up with what she had just said. "Your mother?" he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "That's impossible. Emily, she never had a child." The woman shook her head, her expression unreadable. "She did," she said quietly. "She had me. She just never told you." Richard felt as though the world had come to a standstill. His mind raced, trying to make sense of her words, but nothing added up. Emily couldn't have had a child. She would have told him, wouldn't she? Or had she kept this from him? He took a step back, the weight of the revelation crashing down on him. "No," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "That can't be right. There's no way." "I know this is hard to believe," the woman said, her voice soft but steady, "but it's the truth. My name is Sophie, and Emily was my mother." Richard's chest tightened as the reality of her words began to sink in. He looked at the woman, Sophie, and then at the baby in her arms. His mind was a storm of questions, but he didn't know where to begin. How had this happened? How could he not have known? Why? His voice broke as he finally managed to ask the question, gnawing at him. "Why didn't she tell me? Why would she keep this from me?" Sophie looked down at the ground, her expression filled with sadness. "I don't know," she admitted softly. "I never knew her. She died before I could meet her. I was raised by another family." Richard's heart pounded in his chest. He had spent over 2 decades mourning Emily, believing he had known everything about her. Now, out of nowhere, he was faced with the possibility that she had kept a secret so profound it changed everything. A secret buried with her all these years. He took a deep breath, his mind reeling. "I don't understand," he said, shaking his head. "Why now? Why are you here?" Sophie's eyes met his, and for the first time Richard saw something familiar in them, a glimmer of Emily. "I found out about her a few months ago," she explained. "I've been trying to piece together the truth ever since. When I discovered where she was buried, I had to come." Richard stared at her, still struggling to process it all. His emotions were a whirlwind, confusion, disbelief, and anger. But beneath it all, there was something else, a spark of hope. A hope that maybe, just maybe, this connection to Emily hadn't been lost after all. He glanced down at the baby in Sophie's arms, and something shifted inside him. If Sophie was telling the truth, if Emily really had been her mother, then this child was his grandchild. A part of Emily still existed in the world. For the first time in years, Richard felt something other than grief. He stood frozen, staring at Sophie, his mind still grappling with her revelation. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the leaves around the cemetery, but all he could hear was the pounding of his heart. The baby in Sophie's arms shifted, letting out a soft whimper, and that small sound seemed to snap him out of his daze. How is this possible?" Richard asked, his voice barely audible. His mind raced with questions. He felt betrayed by the very memory of Emily, as if the woman he had mourned for so long had been someone entirely different. But even in the fog of his confusion, he knew one thing. Sophie believed what she was saying. "I know it's a lot to take in," Sophie said, her voice gentle but steady. "I've spent my whole life trying to understand too, but I'm telling you the truth. Emily was my mother." Richard's chest tightened. "Why didn't she tell me?" he muttered, almost to himself. The thought that Emily had kept something so monumental from him was unbearable. He had spent countless nights lying awake, thinking about what they could have had together if only things had been different. Now, those what-ifs had taken on a whole new, painful meaning. Sophie shook her head slowly, her eyes filled with empathy. "I don't know why she kept it from you. I never had the chance to ask her. She passed away when I was still a baby." Richard's thoughts swirled as he tried to focus. There had to be more to the story. Who raised you then? If Emily was your mother, why didn't I know about you? Sophie shifted uncomfortably, glancing down at the ground, as if the explanation was too heavy to carry. "After she died, I was put into the care of another family. I grew up not knowing anything about my real parents until recently. All I had was a name and pieces of information I could barely piece together. I didn't even know where to start looking for you until a few months ago." Richard's heart ached. He had lived his life believing he knew everything there was to know about Emily, only to discover there were entire chapters of her life he hadn't read. "So, you came here looking for answers?" Sophie nodded. "Yes. I wanted to understand who she was, why she kept me a secret. And when I found out where she was buried, I had to come." Richard's gaze fell to Emily's headstone, her name etched in cold, unforgiving stone. It had been his ritual for so long, visiting this grave, talking to her, trying to make peace with her absence. But now, standing here with Sophie and the baby, that peace felt shattered. Everything felt different. His memories, his grief, his understanding of who Emily had been. He took a deep breath, his mind desperately searching for something solid to cling to amidst this storm of emotion. "And this baby," Richard said, his voice cracking slightly as he gestured toward the child in Sophie's arms, "is this my grandchild?" Sophie looked down at the baby, a soft smile breaking through her tension. "Yes," she said quietly, "his name is Daniel." Richard stared at the baby, who looked so small, so fragile. His heart swelled with a mixture of emotions, shock, disbelief, and something else he hadn't felt in a long time, hope. Daniel was a connection to Emily, to the life they could have had, a life that had been hidden from him but now offered a chance to be embraced. As Richard processed it all, the weight of the revelation threatened to overwhelm him. For years he had been trapped in the past, mourning Emily and the life they had lost. Now, standing here, he realized that life hadn't completely disappeared. It had continued, silently, without him. And now he was being given the chance to reclaim a piece of it. But the sense of betrayal lingered. How could Emily have kept this from him? How could she have made such a monumental decision without telling him she was pregnant? "I don't understand," Richard finally said, his voice hoarse. "Why would she hide you from me? Why would she go through this alone?" Sophie's face softened, though there was a sadness in her eyes. "I don't know the details, but I can imagine. Maybe she thought you wouldn't want the responsibility of a child. Or maybe she thought you were too focused on your business to be a father. I don't know, Richard. I wish I did." Richard shook his head, the weight of her words pressing down on him. "But she should have given me a choice. She should have let me decide." Sophie nodded. "Maybe she was scared. Maybe she didn't know how to tell you. Or maybe she thought she was protecting you." The idea that Emily had kept Sophia's secret out of some misguided sense of protection left Richard feeling conflicted. He had always believed that Emily trusted him, that they were partners in everything. Now he was beginning to see that there were parts of her he had never really known. Richard's eyes met Sophie's again, and for the first time, he felt a strange sense of connection, not just to her, but to the life he never knew existed, to the possibilities that had been lost but now could be reclaimed. "What do you want from me?" Richard asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Sophie hesitated, then looked him in the eye. "I don't want anything from you. I just want to know where I came from, and I think you deserve to know the truth about your wife." Richard nodded, her words settling in. The truth about Emily, the truth he had spent so many years without. He didn't know what was going to happen next, but he knew one thing. His life had just irrevocably changed. There was no going back to the way things had been, and maybe, just maybe, that wasn't a bad thing. He stood in stunned silence, unable to fully comprehend the magnitude of what Sophie had just told him. Emily had a daughter. His daughter. A life he had never known. Hidden from him all these years. The betrayal stung, but it was layered with confusion, regret, and something else he hadn't expected. Responsibility. Sophie and the baby in her arms were living proof of a past he hadn't been part of. But they were here now, standing right in front of him. "I still don't understand," Richard finally said, his voice quieter now, the sharp edge of anger fading into something softer. "Emily never told me she was pregnant. How could she have kept this from me?" Sophie's eyes flickered with empathy. "I don't know what her reasons were, Richard. I've asked myself the same question over and over again, but I never got any answers. All I know is that she made that choice, whatever her reasons were, and it's affected both of us." Richard took a deep breath, his thoughts swirling. Emily had always been so private, even with him. They'd had their share of arguments about how much she kept to herself, but this was a secret on a level he couldn't have imagined. "Do you know anything about her? About why she did it?" Richard asked, his voice tentative, almost afraid of the answer. Sophie sighed and looked down at the baby in her arms. "I wish I knew more. The people who raised me didn't know much about her either. I've spent the last few months trying to piece together what happened, but the truth is, there are a lot of gaps. But I know one thing for sure. She loved you." Richard's eyes widened at that. "She told you that?" "No," Sophie said softly, shaking her head. "But I've seen it in everything I've found about her. The way she talked about you to people, the way she lived her life. It was always clear that you were important to her, even if she kept you in the dark about some things." Richard clenched his jaw, a flood of frustration and sadness surging through him. For years, he had struggled to make sense of Emily's death, to accept that the future they had dreamed of would never come to pass. But now, this revelation had ripped open old wounds he thought had long since healed. He wasn't just mourning the loss of his wife anymore. He was grieving the life he had never known, the daughter he had never been given the chance to raise. "And you," Richard said, his voice strained. "Why now? Why did you decide to find me?" Sophie met his gaze with a steady calmness that caught him off guard. "I didn't find out that Emily was my mother until a few months ago. Before that, all I had was a name and a vague story about being adopted. When I learned the truth, I knew I had to come here, to find out who I am and where I came from. And to be honest, I wasn't sure what I would find." Richard's breath caught in his throat. He could see the weight Sophie carried in her eyes, the burden of a past she had only recently uncovered, a burden that had now become his as well. His gaze shifted to the baby nestled in Sophie's arms, now fast asleep. The small rise and fall of the child's chest seemed almost surreal to Richard. This was his grandson, his blood, a continuation of the life he had shared with Emily, even if it had been hidden from him all these years. "Daniel," Sophie said softly, as if reading his thoughts. "His name is Daniel." Richard's gaze softened as he looked at the baby. "Daniel," he repeated quietly. The name felt strange on his tongue, yet it was also grounding in a way he hadn't expected. For so long he had felt adrift, moving through life without any real purpose. But now, standing here with Sophie and Daniel, something was shifting within him. "I didn't come here to ask for anything," Sophie continued, pulling Richard back from his thoughts. I'm not expecting you to play a role in my life, or in Daniel's. I just needed to know the truth. I needed to understand where I came from, and now I do." Richard stared at her, feeling a surge of emotion in his chest. He wasn't sure what Sophie expected from him, but he knew he couldn't just walk away from this. He couldn't walk away from her. "You're my daughter," he said, the words feeling foreign and heavy in his mouth. He had never imagined saying them, especially not like this, in a cemetery, standing in front of his wife's grave. "And that makes Daniel my grandson." Sophie looked at him cautiously, unsure of where he was heading. "I've spent my whole life building something," Richard continued, his voice soft but resolute. "But none of it ever really mattered, not after Emily died. I felt like I had lost everything. But now, I'm beginning to realize that maybe I still have a chance to change that. Maybe I can be something more than just a businessman." Sophie blinked, her expression a mix of surprise and skepticism. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that if you'll let me, I want to be part of your life," Richard said, his voice breaking slightly. "I've missed so much already, but I don't want to miss any more." Sophie stared at him, her expression unreadable for what felt like an eternity. Richard could see the hesitation in Sophie's eyes, the fear of opening herself up to someone she had never known. Yet amidst that uncertainty, there was a flicker of hope. A hope that perhaps, just perhaps, this could be the beginning of something new. "I don't know if it will be easy," Sophie finally said, her voice soft. "There's a lot we don't know about each other." Richard nodded, understanding. "I know, but I'm willing to try if you are." Sophie glanced down at Daniel before looking back at Richard. "Okay," she said quietly, "we can try." For the first time in years, Richard felt a small spark of warmth in his chest. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give him hope that, despite all the loss and pain, there was still something left for him to hold on to. As Richard walked away from the cemetery that day, his mind swirled with emotions. The revelation that Emily had kept such a monumental secret from him weighed heavily on him, and thoughts of Sophie and Daniel lingered in his mind. His life, once so controlled and predictable, felt as if it had been flipped upside down in just a few hours. The city around him bustled with its usual energy, but Richard moved through it as if he were on autopilot. The encounter with Sophie had shaken him to his core, forcing him to question everything he thought he knew about his past. As much as he wanted to feel anger or betrayal toward Emily, he couldn't ignore the strange sense of responsibility that now gripped him. Sophie was his daughter, and Daniel was his grandson. He couldn't walk away from that. Back at his apartment, the rain had started again, tapping gently against the windows. Richard stood in the dimly lit room, staring out at the city as his thoughts returned to Emily. He remembered her laughter, the way she used to look at him, and the dreams they had shared before everything came crashing down. He had spent years trying to preserve her memory, keeping her alive in some small way through his grief. But now, with Sophie's revelation, Richard began to wonder if he had ever truly known Emily at all. Why had she hidden this from him? What had she been thinking during those final months of her life? Questions buzzed relentlessly in Richard's mind, demanding answers he wasn't sure he could ever uncover. He moved to his desk, where he kept a small collection of keepsakes from his time with Emily. Old photos, letters, and little trinkets that once held meaning for them both. He picked up a photo from their early days together, a moment when everything seemed full of promise. They looked so happy, so in love. It was difficult for him to reconcile that version of Emily with the woman who had kept such a life-altering secret from him. Sitting down, Richard pulled out a worn notebook from the desk drawer, something he hadn't touched in years. It was Emily's journal, a record she had kept on and off throughout their marriage. He had found it after she died, but had never had the heart to read it, fearing it would only deepen his grief. Now, however, it felt like his only hope for understanding what had transpired. With a deep breath, Richard opened the journal. The handwriting was familiar, the elegant script he had seen in countless notes and letters over the years. He flipped through the pages, reading her thoughts on mundane things, the dinners they had shared, the vacations they had taken, but nothing stood out. He was searching for something, anything, that might explain why she had hidden Sophie from him. Then, toward the back of the journal, he found it. The entry was dated just a few months before Emily's death. As Richard's eyes scanned the page, his heart began to race. "I don't know what to do. I'm terrified. How could I let this happen now, after all these years?" Richard would never understand. He's so focused on the business, on our future, and I can't be the one to take that away from him. He deserves more than I can give him. I just wish I could tell him, but I know it would destroy him. I can't let him see me like this. I can't let him know. Richard's chest tightened as he read Emily's words. She had been scared of how he would react, scared of how her pregnancy would alter their lives. But why hadn't she trusted him? Why had she thought he wouldn't want to be part of it? The realization struck him like a punch to the gut. Emily hadn't kept Sophie a secret because she didn't want him to know. She had done it because she believed it was for his own good. She was trying to protect him in her own way, shielding him from the burden of raising a child at a time when their lives were already so complicated. Richard slumped back in his chair, overwhelmed by the weight of it all. It wasn't betrayal that Emily had shown, it was fear. Fear of his reaction, fear of how it would change their lives. In her misguided attempt to shield him from her own pain, she had made a choice that led to profound consequences. Sophie had grown up without knowing her father, and Richard had been robbed of the chance to be part of her life and to know Daniel. He struggled to process the fact that he had a grandson. Closing the journal, he felt his mind spinning. There was no way to change what had happened, no way to go back and fix Emily's choices. But there was still a path forward. Sophie had come to him seeking answers, and now, more than ever, Richard knew he couldn't turn his back on her. Standing up, his resolve solidified, Richard realized that if there was one thing he could still do, it was to be there for Sophie and Daniel. He had already lost too much time, and he wasn't about to lose any more. The next morning, Richard made a decision. He needed to reach out to Sophie. He had promised her that he would try. And now, more than ever, he was determined to keep that promise. Although he wasn't sure how they would navigate the complicated web of emotions between them, he was willing to figure it out. He picked up the phone and dialed the number Sophie had given him, his heart racing as he waited for her to answer, unsure of what he would say when she did. After a few rings, Sophie's voice came through the line, soft but steady. "Hello?" "Sophie," Richard began, his voice betraying his nervousness. "It's me, Richard. I've been thinking about everything, and I think we need to talk." There was a pause on the other end, and Richard held his breath, uncertain of her reaction. Finally, Sophie spoke. "Yeah, I think we do." Richard exhaled, the tension in his chest easing slightly. It wasn't much, but it was a start, and right now that was enough. When Richard next saw Sophie, it was in a quiet corner of a small cafe, far from the bustling streets of the city. He had chosen the spot deliberately, intimate yet neutral, a place where they could talk without the weight of the past hanging too heavily over them. Arriving early, he nervously adjusted his shirt collar while sitting at the table, his mind still spinning with everything he had read in Emily's journal. It had brought him closer to understanding her, yet it deepened the ache of not being able to ask her directly about the choices she had made. Richard looked up as Sophie entered the cafe. Daniel cradled in her arms. She spotted him immediately and walked over, her expression calm but cautious. There was a tension in her movements, as if she wasn't sure how this meeting would unfold. "Hi," she said softly, settling into the chair across from him. She shifted Daniel in her arms, trying to make him comfortable before meeting Richard's gaze again. "Thanks for meeting me." Richard nodded, his throat tightening with nerves. "Of course," he replied, his voice a little rougher than he intended. He glanced down at Daniel, who was looking up at him with wide, curious eyes but remained quiet. "How is he?" Richard asked, his voice gentle. Sophie smiled faintly, brushing a hand over the baby's head. "He's doing well. Growing fast." A brief silence fell between them, neither quite sure how to begin the conversation that loomed ahead. Richard cleared his throat, deciding it was best to dive right in. "I've been thinking a lot about what you told me," he said, his voice low. "I found something that explains a bit of why Emily didn't tell me about you." Sophie raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued yet guarded. "What did you find?" Richard hesitated for a moment before reaching into his jacket and pulling out Emily's journal. He slid it across the table toward her. "I found this. It's her journal from the last year of her life. She wrote about her fears, her worries, why she kept you a secret." Sophie stared at the journal, her fingers grazing the edges of the cover, but not opening it. "She wrote about me?" Richard nodded. "She didn't name you directly, but it's clear she was scared. Scared of how I would react. Scared of how having a child would affect our lives. She thought she was protecting me by keeping it a secret." Sophie's expression softened, her hand resting on the journal for a moment before she pulled it back. "I've spent my whole life wondering why she didn't want me," she said quietly, her voice tinged with a sadness Richard hadn't seen before. "It's hard to hear that it wasn't just about me, that she was trying to protect you too." Richard leaned forward, his eyes searching hers. "It wasn't that she didn't want you, Sophie. I can see now that she was overwhelmed. She didn't know how to handle everything. But that doesn't mean she didn't love you. I think she was just lost." Sophie let out a long breath, her shoulders sagging slightly. "I always imagined that if I found out why she gave me up, it would provide some kind of closure. But now it just feels so complicated." Richard nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "I know it's not easy, but the one thing I've learned is that you can't change the past. You can only decide what to do with the present." There was a pause, and Richard could see the emotions flickering across Sophie's face. Sadness, confusion, but also a hint of relief. It was as if hearing those words about her mother had lifted some of the burden she had carried for so long. "I don't know what to do with all of this," Sophie admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've spent so much time feeling angry, at her, at you, and now I don't know what to feel." Richard's heart ached at the raw vulnerability in her voice. He wanted to say something, anything, to make it better. But he knew there were no simple answers. They were both navigating uncharted territory, trying to make sense of the mess that had been left behind. "I get it," Richard said softly. "I've been angry too. But maybe we can try to figure this out together." Sophie looked at him, her eyes searching his for reassurance. "You really want to be a part of my life after everything?" Richard replied without hesitation. "I do. I've already lost so much time, Sophie. I don't want to lose any more." "If you're willing to give this a chance, I am too," Richard said. Sophie paused for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I'm willing to try, but I need time, Richard. This is a lot to take in." Richard reached across the table, his hand hovering near hers without touching. "I understand. We'll take it one step at a time. There's no rush." Sophie glanced at Daniel, who had fallen asleep in her arms, and then back at Richard. "He doesn't have a grandfather, you know," she said softly, a hint of a smile breaking through. Richard's heart swelled. "I'd like to change that," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. Sophie nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek that she quickly wiped away. "I think Daniel would like that too." For the first time, Richard felt a flicker of hope. It was fragile, but it was there. He had spent so many years believing his life had ended when Emily died, that there was no way forward. But now, sitting here with Sophie and Daniel, he realized there was still something worth fighting for. They sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of their shared past hanging in the air, but there was also something new, a tentative connection, and a chance to rebuild what had been lost. As they left the cafe, Richard walked beside Sophie, feeling the warmth of the sun breaking through the clouds for the first time that day. It was a small, almost imperceptible change, but it felt like a sign. For the first time in years, Richard allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the future could hold something more. The days following their meeting at the cafe were filled with cautious optimism. Richard and Sophie began to see more of each other, though there was always a certain hesitance in the air, as if they were both afraid of saying or doing something that would shatter the fragile bond they were beginning to form. Determined to show Sophie that he was serious about being a part of her life, Richard also respected her need for space. It wasn't easy. Every time he looked at her, he was reminded of how much he had missed and how much time had slipped through his fingers. As much as he wanted to embrace this new chapter, the past still weighed heavily on his mind. His thoughts often drifted back to Emily and the choices she had made. He had spent so many years idealizing her, putting her on a pedestal and reconciling the woman he loved with the one who had kept such a life-altering secret from him proved to be a challenge. One evening, after a particularly long day, Richard sat in his living room nursing a glass of whiskey. He hadn't seen Sophie for a few days, and while he wanted to reach out, he was also trying to respect her boundaries. It was a delicate balance that he wasn't entirely sure how to navigate. He knew that pushing too hard might drive her away, but not pushing hard enough felt like letting another opportunity slip through his fingers. His phone buzzed on the table beside him, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a text from Sophie. "Can we talk tomorrow? There's something I need to tell you." Richard's heart skipped a beat. The message was simple, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. He quickly typed out a reply, agreeing to meet her, then leaned back, his mind racing with possibilities. What could she need to tell him? Was it something about Daniel or maybe something about Emily? Perhaps a new piece of the puzzle that would help him understand everything better. The next morning, they met at a park not far from Sophie's apartment. Daniel was with her, bundled up in his stroller. As Richard approached, he could see the tension in Sophie's posture. She smiled when she saw him, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Hey," she said, her voice soft yet strained. "Thanks for meeting me." "Of course," he replied, concern growing. "What's going on?" Sophie gestured to a nearby bench, and they sat down facing the lake. The water was calm, reflecting the clear blue sky above, but the atmosphere between them felt anything but peaceful. Richard sensed that whatever Sophie had to say was weighing heavily on her. "I've been thinking a lot," Sophie began, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "About everything. About you, about my mom, about Daniel. And there's something I haven't told you yet." Richard's heart pounded in his chest. He tried to keep his expression calm, but he could feel the tension building inside him. "You can tell me anything, Sophie. Whatever it is, we'll figure it out." Sophie nodded, but her gaze remained fixed on the lake. Her voice was barely above a whisper as she said, "I've always wondered why my mom didn't tell you about me. I thought maybe it was because she didn't want to burden you, or because she was scared of how you'd react. But I found something recently, something that might explain it." Richard's breath caught in his throat. "What did you find?" Sophie hesitated for a moment before reaching into her bag and pulling out a small, folded piece of paper. She handed it to Richard, her eyes finally meeting his, revealing a mix of fear and sadness. Richard unfolded the paper carefully, his hands trembling slightly. It was a letter, old and worn, with frayed edges and slightly faded ink. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was Emily's. He began to read, his heart pounding as the words came into focus. "Richard, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I need to write it anyway. I've been keeping something from you, something that I'm not sure I'll ever have the courage to tell you in person. I'm pregnant, and I'm terrified. I know you've always said you didn't want children, and I've respected that. But now with this news, I don't know what to do. I don't want to lose you, but I also don't want to burden you with something you never wanted. So I'm making the choice to keep this from you. Not because I don't love you, but because I do. I hope one day you'll forgive me for this." Richard's hand shook as he finished reading. He stared at the letter, his mind struggling to process the words. Emily had been pregnant, and she had known. She had made the decision to keep it from him because she thought it was what he wanted, based on something he had said years ago before they were even married. I don't understand," Richard whispered, his voice barely audible. "I never told her I didn't want children. I mean, maybe I mentioned it in passing when we were younger, but I never meant it like that. We thought we would figure it out together." Sophie looked at him, her eyes filled with sympathy. "I think she was just scared, Richard. She didn't want to lose you, and she thought this was the only way to keep you." Richard shook his head, the weight of the revelation crashing down on him. He had spent all these years believing that he and Emily were on the same page, that they understood each other perfectly. Now he realized they had been living with different fears and expectations, and those unspoken things had driven them apart in ways he couldn't have imagined. "I didn't know," Richard said, his voice breaking. "If I had known, I would have been there for her. I would have been there for you. Sophie placed a gentle hand on his arm, her touch grounding him. I know, and maybe she did too, deep down, but she made the choice she thought was right at the time, and now we're here. Richard's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment he couldn't speak. The pain of what had been lost, of what could have been, felt almost unbearable. But Sophie was right. They couldn't change the past. All they could do was move forward. He looked at Sophie, the daughter he had never known, and then at Daniel, the grandson who had entered his life so unexpectedly. I don't want to waste any more time, Richard said finally, his voice steady despite the tears in his eyes. I want to be part of your life, Sophie. I want to be there for Daniel. I don't care how complicated it is, we'll figure it out. Sophie smiled through her own tears, nodding slowly. I want that, too. They sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of the past still heavy, but the hope for the future finally starting to break through. It wasn't going to be easy. There were still so many questions, and so much to process, but for the first time, Richard felt like they were both ready to take the next step together. The days following their conversation in the park felt excruciatingly slow for Richard. His mind kept circling back to the letter Sophie had shared. And Emily's words haunted him. She had made a choice rooted in a fear he hadn't even known existed, and that fear had irrevocably altered the course of both their lives. Richard had always prided himself on being in control of his life, his choices, and his emotions. Now, confronted with the fallout of unspoken desires and misunderstood fears, he found himself grappling with the weight of it all. Late one night, Richard sat in his study, nursing a drink while staring at Emily's journal and the letter Sophie had given him. The faint hum of the city outside provided an eerie backdrop to the silence in the room. He felt trapped between the past and the present, unsure how to reconcile the life he once believed in with the painful truths that had emerged. He had wanted children. He recalled dreaming about a future where he and Emily would raise a family together. But life had intervened, the demands of his career, their travels, and the endless possibilities of their busy lives. Children had always been a topic for later, but that later never arrived. The most crushing realization, however, was knowing that his own offhand comments from years ago had been enough to compel Emily to keep such a monumental secret from him. He struggled to recall the specifics of that conversation. They had been young, not long after getting together, and he might have mentioned that he wasn't ready for kids, perhaps even that he didn't want them at all. But he never meant it as a final decision. He had assumed they would talk about it more seriously one day. Yet that day had never come, and Emily had made her choice alone. Taking a deep breath, Richard stared down at the papers in front of him. He was unsure how to feel about Emily anymore. The grief he had carried for so long was now morphing into something more complex, a blend of love, anger, and regret. He still loved her. He always would. But that love was now intertwined with a profound sense of loss, not just for Emily, but for the life they could have shared and the family they could have built. Then there was Sophie, the daughter he had never known. The child Emily had kept from him in an attempt to protect him from a burden he would have gladly embraced. Richard wanted to be there for her, to make up for lost time, but he felt at a loss about how to bridge the gap between them. They were strangers, connected by blood, yet separated by years of silence and secrets. As much as he wanted to step into the roles of father and grandfather, he knew it wouldn't be that simple. Sophie had her own life, her own experiences, and her own pain. He couldn't just waltz in and expect to fill a void that had existed for years. He would have to earn her trust, earn his place in her life, and that couldn't happen overnight. Just then, the phone on his desk buzzed, pulling Richard from his thoughts. It was a message from Sophie. Are you free tomorrow? Daniel has a doctor's appointment in the afternoon, and I was wondering if you wanted to come with us. No pressure, just thought you might want to be there. Richard stared at the screen, his heart swelling with both anxiety and hope. Sophie was reaching out. She was offering him a chance to be part of her and Daniel's lives, a chance to take the first steps toward building something new together. He quickly typed a response, trying not to overthink it. I'd love to come. Just let me know the time. As soon as he hit send, a wave of relief washed over him. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He wasn't sure what to expect or how it would feel to embrace this new role, but he was willing to try. For Sophie, for Daniel, and for the family he had lost, and the one he still had a chance to be a part of. The next day, Richard met Sophie outside the pediatrician's office. She was standing by the entrance, with Daniel bundled up in his stroller, looking both relieved and nervous to see him. Richard couldn't help but smile as he approached them. Daniel's big eyes blinked up at him from beneath his hat, and for a moment, all of Richard's doubts melted away. "Hey," Sophie said, her voice soft but welcoming. "Thanks for coming." "Of course," Richard replied, crouching down to get a better look at Daniel. "How's the little guy doing?" "He's good, just a bit fussy but nothing unusual," Sophie said, smiling faintly as she adjusted Daniel's blanket. "I thought it might be nice for you to be here, to get to know him a little." Richard's heart warmed at her words. He knew it wasn't easy for her to offer this. Sophie had her walls up for good reason. But she was trying, and that was more than he could have hoped for. They walked into the office together, engaging in small talk as they waited for Daniel's appointment. Richard found himself watching Sophie, observing the way she interacted with her son. The tenderness in her voice, the way she seemed to intuitively understand his every need. It was both heartwarming and heartbreaking. He couldn't help but wonder what it would have been like if he had been there for her, if he had been part of her life from the very beginning. But there was no point in dwelling on the past. He was here now, and that was what mattered. The doctor's appointment was routine, just a quick checkup, but for Richard it felt monumental. As he sat beside Sophie, watching the doctor weigh and measure Daniel, he realized these were the moments he had been missing all his life. The simple, everyday experiences of being a parent, watching a child grow and learn. It wasn't glamorous or grand, but it was real. It was the kind of connection he had longed for without even realizing it. When the appointment was over and they stepped back into the crisp afternoon air, Richard turned to Sophie, feeling a lump rise in his throat. "Thank you," he said, his voice quiet but sincere, "for letting me be part of this." Sophie looked at him, her eyes softening. "You're welcome. I want you to be part of it. I know it's not going to be easy, but I think we can figure it out." Richard nodded, feeling the weight of her words. They were on the same page, both cautious but hopeful, both willing to take the necessary steps to build things together. As they stood there watching the sunset behind the city's skyline, Richard allowed himself to believe that, despite everything, there was still time to heal, time to make amends, and time to be the father and grandfather he had always wanted to be. As the days turned into weeks, Richard felt a sense of cautious optimism growing inside him. He began spending more time with Sophie and Daniel, finding a rhythm in their interactions that felt both unfamiliar and comforting. The initial awkwardness of their new relationship slowly began to fade, replaced by a fragile but genuine connection. Richard was careful not to overstep, allowing Sophie to set the pace while making it clear that he was fully committed to being part of their lives. One afternoon, Sophie invited Richard to her apartment for the first time. It was a modest place, small but cozy, and as Richard stepped inside, he could see the care Sophie had put into making it a home for herself and Daniel. Toys were scattered across the living room floor, and a soft blanket was draped over the couch. The apartment smelled faintly of baby lotion and freshly brewed coffee. "Make yourself comfortable," Sophie said, motioning toward the couch as she took Daniel out of his stroller. "I'll get us some coffee." Richard nodded, settling onto the couch and looking around the room. He felt a strange mixture of emotions, pride in seeing the life Sophie had built for herself, but also a deep sense of regret for not being there to witness any of it. He had missed so much, and no matter how hard he tried to move forward, that sense of loss would always linger. As Sophie disappeared into the kitchen, Richard's gaze wandered to a small photo frame on the bookshelf. It captured a moment of Sophie holding Daniel, both of them smiling brightly at the camera, their eyes sparkling with joy. It was a simple image, but it struck Richard deeply. He realized he was looking at the family he never knew he had, a family he was only just beginning to understand. Sophie returned a few moments later, balancing 2 mugs of coffee. She handed one to Richard and settled down across from him, adjusting Daniel on her lap. The baby cooed softly, his chubby hands reaching for his mother's hair. "So," Sophie said, breaking the comfortable silence, "I've been thinking a lot lately about everything. About us, about Mom, and there's something else I think you should know." Richard looked up from his coffee, his heart rate quickening slightly. He had grown accustomed to the idea that there would always be new revelations about Emily and Sophie's past, but that didn't make them any easier to hear. "What is it?" he asked carefully. Sophie took a deep breath, her fingers absent-mindedly playing with Daniel's tiny hand. "After we talked about Mom and why she kept me a secret from you, I started digging a little deeper. I wanted to understand more about her life and why she made the choices she did. I found something that, well, it changes things." Richard frowned, setting his mug down on the coffee table. "What do you mean?" Sophie hesitated for a moment before standing up and walking over to the bookshelf. She pulled out a small box that Richard hadn't noticed before and brought it back to the couch, placing it between them. "This," she said quietly, opening the box, "was in Mom's things. It's a letter, but it's not from her. It's from someone else, someone I think you knew." Richard's stomach tightened as Sophie handed him the letter. He unfolded it slowly, his eyes scanning the familiar handwriting. It was addressed to Emily, but the signature at the bottom made his heart stop. It was from someone named James. Not just any James, but James Porter, an old friend from Richard's younger days. They had lost touch over the years, but they had once been close, long before Richard had met Emily. As he read the letter, Richard's blood ran cold. "Emily, I don't know if I'll ever have the courage to send this to you, but I need to put it down on paper, even if only for my own peace of mind. I know we've kept this secret for so long, but it's weighing on me now more than ever. Richard has no idea about what happened between us, and I can't bear to keep pretending. I'm not asking you to tell him, I know how complicated things are. But I need you to know that I've never stopped thinking about you, and what we had. If things were different, I would have fought harder for you, but I know you made your choice. I just hope you're happy, even if it's not with me. With love, James." Richard's hands trembled as he finished reading. He stared at the letter, his mind reeling. Had James and Emily been together? Was there something between them that he had never known about? Sophie watched him carefully, her expression filled with empathy. "I didn't want to tell you right away," she said softly. "I wasn't sure how you'd take it, but I thought you deserved to know." Richard couldn't find the words. His heart pounded in his chest, the weight of the revelation crashing over him like a tidal wave. He had known James for years, trusted him, considered him a friend, but this letter suggested something entirely different. Something Richard hadn't even considered. "Are you saying," Richard began, his voice shaking, "are you saying that James and Emily—" Sophie nodded slowly, her eyes filled with understanding. "I don't know all the details, I don't know when it happened or how long it lasted, but yeah, it seems like they were involved at some point." Richard felt as if the ground had been pulled out from beneath him. He stood up, pacing the small living room, as his thoughts raced. He had always believed that he and Emily shared something special, something unbreakable. But this letter called everything into question. Had Emily loved James? Had she kept this secret out of fear of losing Richard? Or was there something deeper that he had been blind to all along? "I can't believe this," Richard muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't even know what to think." Sophie stood up and walked over to him, placing a comforting hand on his arm. "I know this is hard, Richard. Believe me, I've been struggling with it too. But I don't think Mom ever wanted to hurt you. I think she was just scared, like she was with everything else." Richard swallowed hard, feeling a tumultuous mix of anger and sadness boiling inside him. He had spent years mourning Emily, grieving the life they had lost, and now it felt as though that life had been built on lies and secrets he had never known. "What do we do with this?" he asked, his voice breaking. "How do we move forward from here?" Sophie sighed, her eyes reflecting the same uncertainty that plagued Richard. "I don't know. I wish I had the answers, but I think it's just going to take time. Time to process everything, time to figure out what it all means." Richard nodded slowly, his mind still spinning. He didn't know how to move forward or reconcile the love he had for Emily with the truth of her relationship with James. But one thing was clear. He wasn't going to lose Sophie, not now, not after everything they had been through. "I don't want to lose you," Richard said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "Whatever happens, whatever we find out, I don't want this to come between us." Sophie looked at him, her eyes softening. "You're not going to lose me, Richard. We're in this together." Richard took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her words. It wasn't the answer he had hoped for, but it was enough for now. Over the next few days, the revelation about James Porter consumed him. He tried to make sense of it, but no matter how much he thought, the answers remained elusive. His mind replayed old memories, moments from his past with both Emily and James, searching for clues that might have hinted at this secret. But nothing stood out. No suspicion had ever crossed his mind. How could he have missed it? Richard found himself pacing his apartment late into the night, unable to sleep. The letter Sophie had discovered was always on his mind, raising so many questions. Had Emily loved James? Had it been a brief affair or something more serious? And why had James never told him the truth? More than anything, Richard felt a deep sense of betrayal. He had trusted both Emily as his wife and James as one of his closest friends, but now that trust felt shattered, replaced by a gnawing doubt that wouldn't go away. The next morning, Richard made a decision. He needed answers. The uncertainty had become unbearable. After some searching, he managed to find James's contact information. They hadn't spoken in years, not since they had drifted apart after Emily's death. But this was something Richard couldn't ignore. He had to confront him. With his heart pounding, Richard dialed the number. It rang a few times before a familiar voice answered. "Hello?" James's voice sounded older, more fatigued than Richard remembered, but it was unmistakable. "James," Richard said, his voice tight. "It's Richard Lawson." There was a pause on the other end, and Richard could sense James's hesitation. When he finally responded, it was with a tentative, "Richard, it's been a long time." "It has," Richard agreed, keeping his tone steady despite the tension building inside him. "I need to talk to you about Emily." Another pause. "Emily?" James's voice was cautious, as if he already knew what was coming. "What about her?" "I found a letter," Richard said, his words sharp now. "A letter you wrote to her about something that happened between the two of you. I think you know what I'm talking about." Silence hung heavy in the air, the unspoken truth palpable between them. When James finally spoke, his voice was low, almost resigned. "I didn't think you'd ever find out." Richard clenched his jaw, the confirmation hitting him hard. "So it's true then? You and Emily? What was it? An affair? A one-time thing?" James let out a heavy sigh. "It wasn't like that, Richard. It wasn't an affair. It was complicated." "Complicated?" Richard's anger flared. "That's all you have to say? I trusted you, James. You were my friend." "I know," James replied, his voice heavy with regret. "I never wanted to hurt you, Richard, and I don't think Emily did either. What happened between us was a mistake, but it wasn't what you think." Richard tightened his grip on the phone. "Then tell me what it was, because from where I'm standing it looks like both of you kept a pretty significant secret from me." James hesitated again, his voice quiet and almost defeated. "It was a long time ago, before you and Emily were even serious. We had a brief fling, but it ended. Emily chose you, Richard. She loved you. Whatever happened between us was over long before you two got married." Richard's heart raced. It may have been over, but that didn't lessen the sting of betrayal. "Why didn't either of you tell me?" "I don't know," James admitted. "At first, it didn't seem like it mattered. It was in the past, and we both moved on. But as time went on, I guess we were both afraid of what it would do to you and your marriage. And then after Emily died, I couldn't bring myself to tell you. I didn't want to add to your pain." Richard shook his head, anger simmering just beneath the surface. "You think keeping it from me was better? You think I wouldn't have wanted to know the truth?" James's voice was heavy with regret. "I don't know, Richard. I thought I was doing the right thing at the time. But looking back, maybe I should have told you." Richard felt his chest tighten. He wanted to yell, to release the anger and frustration that had been building since he read the letter. Yet, at the same time, exhaustion washed over him. The weight of all these secrets and lies was overwhelming. "I don't know what to say to you, James," Richard finally said, his voice strained. "I can't even process this." "I understand," James replied quietly. "I'm sorry, Richard. I truly am. If I could go back and change things, I would. All I can do now is apologize and hope you can find it in yourself to forgive me." Forgiveness? Richard wasn't sure he was capable of that right now. The betrayal felt too fresh, too raw. Yet a part of him recognized that clinging to the anger wouldn't bring him peace either. "I don't know if I can forgive you, James," Richard admitted honestly, "but I appreciate you telling me the truth." There was a long pause before James spoke again. "If you ever want to talk, I'm here. I know this is a lot to take in, but I'm willing to answer any questions you have." Richard hesitated. He wasn't sure he wanted to hear more, to dig deeper into a past that had already caused him so much pain. But one thing was clear: he needed time. Time to process, time to heal. "I need some time," Richard said finally. "I don't know what comes next, but I need to figure that out." "Take all the time you need," James replied softly. "I'm sorry, Richard, truly." When the call ended, Richard stood there for a long moment, the phone still in his hand, his mind swirling with conflicting emotions. He had the truth now, or at least part of it, but it didn't provide the closure he had hoped for. If anything, it only left him feeling more lost. Later that evening, Richard sat down with Sophie to discuss his conversation with James. She listened quietly, her expression unreadable, but he could see the same conflicted emotions flickering in her eyes. "I'm not sure what to think anymore," Richard admitted, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "I thought uncovering the truth would help, but now I just feel lost." Sophie nodded, her hand resting gently on Daniel's back as he slept in her arms. "I understand. I've been grappling with similar feelings. But maybe the truth isn't always about closure. Perhaps it's about understanding the past so we can learn how to move forward." Richard looked at her, feeling a surge of gratitude for her presence in his life. Despite everything, they were still here together, facing an uncertain future. And maybe that was enough for now. "I think you're right," he said softly. "I don't know what comes next, but I want to figure it out with you." Sophie smiled warmly, her eyes reflecting understanding. "We'll figure it out one step at a time." As Richard sat there with his daughter and grandson, he realized that despite the pain and confusion of the past, there was still something worth fighting for. The truth had been messy, complicated, and heartbreaking, but it had also drawn him closer to Sophie and Daniel. For the first time in a long while, he felt a glimmer of hope for the future. The weeks following Richard's conversation with James were marked by quiet introspection. The revelations about Emily and James compelled Richard to confront a part of his past he had never expected. He found himself swinging between anger and sorrow, but slowly as the days went by, a sense of acceptance began to take root. It wasn't an easy journey. Some mornings Richard still woke up feeling the heavy weight of betrayal and the lingering ache of not having known everything about Emily. Yet he began to realize that, painful as it was, the past couldn't be changed. What mattered now was how he chose to live with it and what he would do with the time he had left. Sophie had been a constant source of support throughout this process. Their relationship, though still delicate, grew stronger with each passing day. She welcomed him into her life and into Daniel's, giving Richard a reason to keep moving forward. One afternoon, Richard found himself at the park with Sophie and Daniel. It was a warm day, the sun casting a golden hue over the grass as they strolled along the path. Daniel was in his stroller, babbling happily as Sophie pushed him, and Richard walked beside them, feeling a sense of peace that had long eluded him. They reached a bench by the lake, and Sophie motioned for Richard to sit. She unbuckled Daniel from the stroller and set him on her lap, smiling as he squirmed excitedly at the sight of the ducks swimming nearby. "It's hard to believe how much he's grown already," Richard remarked, watching Daniel with a smile. "Yeah, it feels like just yesterday he was a tiny baby," Sophie replied, her voice soft with affection. She glanced at Richard, her expression thoughtful. "I'm really glad you're here, Richard. I know it hasn't been easy, but I'm thankful we're figuring this out together." Richard felt a lump form in his throat. He had been waiting for this moment, a sign that they were moving in the right direction. I'm glad too, he replied softly. I know I've made mistakes, and there's so much I wish I could change, but I'm grateful for this, for you and Daniel. Sophie nodded, her eyes meeting his with a warmth that hadn't been present when they first met. I know it's been hard for both of us, but we're here now, and I think that's what truly matters. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the ducks glide across the water. Richard's mind drifted back to everything that had led him to this moment. The grief, the secrets, the painful revelations. But for the first time, he didn't feel weighed down by it. Instead, a sense of clarity washed over him. I've been thinking a lot, Richard said after a while, breaking the silence. About the past, about everything that happened. I've realized that holding on to the anger and hurt isn't helping anyone. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand why Emily made the choices she did, but I think I'm ready to let go of the need for answers. Sophie looked at him, her expression soft yet serious. That's a big step, Richard. I know how hard this has been for you. Richard nodded, acknowledging the truth in her words. It has been tough, but I don't want the past to define what happens next. I want to focus on what we have now, on being there for you and Daniel. Sophie smiled, her eyes shining with gratitude. That means a lot to me, Richard. I know this hasn't been easy for any of us, but I think you're right. We can't change the past, but we can move forward. A sense of relief washed over Richard. The pain hadn't vanished. He knew it would always linger beneath the surface, but it no longer felt like a burden he couldn't carry. He had discovered something else, something stronger, a purpose. As they continued to sit by the lake, Sophie shifted in her seat, her voice hesitant, yet filled with hope. You know, I've been thinking about Daniel. He's going to need a lot of people in his life who care about him and love him, and I believe you could be a big part of that if you want to be. Richard's heart swelled at her words. I want that more than anything, he replied, his voice thick with emotion. I want to be part of his life, part of yours. Sophie smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. I'm really glad to hear that, because I think he could use a grandfather. The word hit Richard with an unexpected force, but in the best possible way. Grandfather. It was a role he had never envisioned for himself, especially after years of solitude and grief. Yet now, it felt like the most important role he could ever have. I'd be honored, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know how good I'll be at it, but I'm willing to try. Sophie laughed softly, her hand resting gently on Daniel's tiny foot. That's all we can do, right? Just try. They sat together, watching Daniel go at the ducks, and for the first time in a long while, Richard felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. Over the next few months, Richard's life continued to transform in ways he had never anticipated. He and Sophie grew closer, navigating their complicated relationship with honesty and patience. There were still moments of tension and lingering questions between them, but they were learning to face these challenges together. Richard became more involved in Daniel's life, looking forward to the time spent with his grandson. Whether it was taking him to the park, reading him stories, or simply watching him explore the world with wide-eyed wonder, Richard discovered a new kind of joy, one he hadn't realized he was capable of feeling. Through it all, he learned to let go of the anger and bitterness that had once consumed him. He found peace in the understanding that he might never have all the answers about Emily, and that some things were better left in the past. What mattered now was the future, the life he was building with Sophie and Daniel, the family he was rediscovering. One evening, as Richard sat in his apartment looking out over the city skyline, he realized just how much had changed. The loneliness that had once defined him was gone, replaced by a sense of connection and belonging he hadn't felt in years. He still visited Emily's grave occasionally, but those visits had changed. They became less about mourning and more about reflection. He had loved her deeply, and that love would always be a part of him. But he understood that he needed to let her go to make room for the life he had found with Sophie and Daniel. As the sun set over the city, casting a warm glow over the skyline, Richard felt a quiet contentment wash over him. It wasn't the life he had imagined all those years ago, but it was a life he had come to cherish. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to believe that the future, no matter how uncertain, could be filled with hope.